Hello, everybody, and welcome to this special edition of the ATS Pulmonary Rehab Assembly Journal Club. My name is Alan Hamilton, and I'm a member of the PR Assembly Web Committee. I'm also a Senior Director of Research at the COPD Foundation and an adjunct professor at McMaster University in Canada. My co-moderator for today's discussion is Dr. Omid Porshahid, who is an assistant professor at Temple University. So a couple of housekeeping items before I introduce today's article and panel. So I'd like to kindly ask all attendees to mute their microphones as this is a recorded session. When we reach the discussion segment, we would really like a lively discussion, and so would appreciate any questions or comments you may have, preferably by hearing from you in person. To do this, please select Raise Hand, which can be found in the Reactions function of your control panel. We will then invite you to unmute yourself so you can ask your question. Alternatively, you can put your question in the chat function or tweet your question using our Twitter handle at PR_assembly, and we will read it out. So in this special PR Assembly Journal Club, we're paying tribute to the 30th anniversary of the landmark paper titled Randomized Controlled Trial of Respiratory Rehabilitation by Dr. Roger Goldstein and colleagues from the University of Toronto in Canada, in collaboration with Dr. Gord Guyatt and colleagues from McMaster University in Canada, published in the Lancet in 1994. Dr. Rachael Evans from the University of Leicester in the UK and current chair of the Pulmonary Rehab Assembly will present the article. We are delighted that Dr. Goldstein, the first author of the article, is joining us from West Park Hospital and the University of Toronto in Canada. Today's expert discussion panel includes Dr. Marilyn Moy from Harvard Medical School and chair-elect of the Pulmonary Rehab Assembly, Dr. Martijn Spruit from Ciro Maastricht University in the Netherlands, and first author of the ATS ERS statement titled Key Concepts and Advances in Pulmonary Rehab, published in 2013, and Dr. Carolyn Rochester from Yale School of Medicine, and first author of the ATS Clinical Practice Guideline for PR for adults with chronic respiratory disease, published in August 2023. So Dr. Goldstein's article provides a very appropriate foundation for the theme of our discussion today, which we have framed as evidence of therapeutic benefit of pulmonary rehab in chronic lung disease from 1994 to present and beyond. Dr. Goldstein and our distinguished panel will offer reflections and insights on where we were prior to 1994, the impact of Dr. Goldstein's paper in terms of growth in the body of evidence of therapeutic benefit of PR since 1994, where we are now in 2024, and where we need to go in the future. So I'll now hand over to Dr. Evans, who will present the study.
Thank you, Alan, and thanks for the invite from ATS. It's a pleasure to present this paper today. Now, just bear with me while I get my slides in the right format. Right, well, as you've just heard from Alan, it is 30 years since this largest at the time randomised controlled trial, which was published in the Lancet, and it was published to the day, so we're very excited about that. So I'm first going to take you through the history of pulmonary rehabilitation, probably through my own eyes. This was largely came through my introductory chapter of my thesis. And for anyone here that's interested in rehabilitation or doing a doctoral or postdoctoral involving rehabilitation, I really would recommend going into the history of whatever you're doing, because I really do think we learn a lot from doing that. Now, I haven't delved back beyond 30 years, but starting in 1953 was when I could find a first reference really around respiratory exercises for patients with emphysema. Then in 1959 was one of the first mentions of rehabilitation for chronic lung disease. So this was not a new concept, but as with all things in medicine, trying to get sensible things that clinicians think might work into clinical practice takes a long time. And one of those things that I think why we should go back into history is to always think, what could we do even quicker now? And what can we do to really improve care? There's a first uncontrolled trial that I could find with 43 patients in 1967, introducing the concept of a graded exercise program, and that was published in California Medicine in 1967. And then Tom Petty, he'd written a lot, but this was a really seminal report of 182 patients with chronic airflow limitation, COPD as was. And he very eloquently discusses an ambulatory care system. And I know that when I was reflecting, writing my thesis, I did wonder what on earth poor Tom Petty thought about things 30 years on and what he would think really about where we are now. I hope in some ways he would be pleased, but the concept I think he had totally nailed back 54 years ago with an ambulatory care system, and we're still struggling in the UK to really develop true integrated care. Involved education, bronchial hygiene, breathing retraining, physical reconditioning, and oxygen where needed. And that was published in Chest. And if you've not read that, I really would urge people to read through it. 1977, and in the 70s themselves, I have just highlighted some of the trials, and in the early 80s there were others, but there was a controlled trial of 24 people who were chronically bronchitic, and they'd introduced stair climbing, and they also had an outcome measure of a 12-minute walk test, and that was published in Thorax. Now, I've definitely selected this as my own family come from Wales, and for anyone that doesn't know where Wales is, I've put it on the map here. Never go to Wales and tell people that they're English. That always goes down very badly. So Wales, separate country. And they did a randomised control trial of people with COAD, so chronic obstructive airways disease, and coal workers' pneumoconiosis. In Wales, coal mining was a huge industry, and unfortunately left a lot of people with severe chronic respiratory illness. Then there was another small randomised control trial with many of you on the call that are friends with Professor Ambrosino, and then that led also, or over a decade of other trials, led to the first that I could find, report from the European Respiratory Society, the Rehabilitation and Chronic Care Scientific Group, a report on pulmonary rehabilitation in COPD with recommendations for its use. So reflecting through what happened over those decades, you can sort of see that a larger randomised controlled trial was needed. Actually, the patient population, as we went through those decades, there were different descriptions, but by 1992 it does look like we'd pretty much landed on COPD. So at least we knew a little bit more about who we were talking about. The intervention had been named pulmonary rehabilitation, and we seem to know a little bit more about perhaps what that should contain, and certainly that's in that ERS document. I haven't given you the whole history of clinical trial design, but very much evidence-based medicine and the concept of randomised controlled trials were really quite firmly established by then, and the need for a control. And we had better outcome measures, more objective measures to assess both exercise and health status, with Gordon Guyat's work also with the chronic respiratory questionnaire not just being developed, but this concept of a minimum important difference. What, when we talk about the units of a questionnaire, what that might mean to the person. So that's, I suppose, history where the literature finds us, but I wondered, Roger, if at this point you wanted to give us some personal reflections, because I'm always really interested in that, what led up to the study and why yourselves, why West Park, why do things happen? Sometimes it is somebody's own personal motivation, balanced sometimes with a bit of serendipity, and I just wondered if you could give us a few of your own reflections.
I'm happy to do so. I'll just mute for 1 second. Now, there's a code going on in the background here. I'll very briefly, because this is not the main purpose of the paper, things happen by chance. So the way this paper came about, when I moved to West Park, we knew we had a good program. One day I was leaving a meeting of the College of Physicians of Canada, very dull meeting, and on the steps, I was grumbling to myself, I've got this great program, I don't really know how to evaluate it. I happened to be standing next to someone I didn't know. Turned out it was Gordon Guyatt. Gordon Guyatt is a real scientist and a real hero, and in the Medical Hall of Fame. And Gordon Guyatt turned to me and said, "That's odd. I've got these outcome measures, this chronic respiratory questionnaire and 6-minute walk test, and no one's interested in them at all." So that's how this came about. I said, "Well, maybe we could do something together." He said, "Yes." So I thought within a week, I'll try and get a protocol to him and see if we can do something together. And he beat me to it. Within 48 hours, he had written a protocol and left it on my desk. So that's one reflection I can give you. How did it happen? A little bit by chance, and a little bit by design, because we were seeing a lot of people with COPD.
Wonderful.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Roger. And to the audience, I didn't know that story actually before, so that's brilliant. So yes, the science was there, the thoughts were there, the scientists were there, clinicians were there, and then it's just sometimes what catalyzes things at a moment in time, isn't it? It's interesting. And West Park Healthcare Centre, for anyone here that doesn't know, it's based in Toronto. It's slightly out of the city, Roger, isn't it? I worked there for 2 years as a postdoc, started 15 years ago, almost to the day. And it is a wonderful place, and people there usually have an inpatient program, even still, that even the legacy of what you were doing clinically is definitely lived on. So to get back to the paper, it is a randomised controlled trial and single centre at West Park Healthcare Centre. The eligibility, and this is again where I think sometimes the details of we know about landmark papers, but we don't always know the details. And actually even reading it, even though I've read it many times, actually reading it fresh eyes for this, there were still other things that you pick up. This was a very severe population. So they had severe but stable COPD. Their FEV1 had to be less than 40% predicted, and they had to have airflow obstruction with an FEV1 FVC ratio of less than 0.7. Now, we probably wouldn't have this in our limitations now, but at the time they had to be a non-smoker for at least 2 months. They had to have dyspnea, so difficulty in breathing and breathlessness, during 3 or more activities of daily living. Quite standard, no associated conditions which might limit exercise or the ability to take part in the study itself, so no major limitations with cognitive functioning, and able to communicate in English. And the exclusion were having undertaken rehabilitation within the last 2 years and things that were sensible for safety. The rehabilitation programme is really quite unique, certainly from a UK perspective, is really quite unique. I know others of you in Europe and America and elsewhere may well have programmes similar to these. And these aren't photos from 30 years ago, but they are my own from about 15 years ago. So it was an inpatient programme for the first 2 months, followed by 4 months of some outpatient care. So in those 2 months of rehabilitation, I'm going to go down to exactly what that programme entailed. There was exercise and education. The exercise, they had 13 minutes of stretching and breathing exercises. 3 times a week, they had treadmill interval training, 2 to 3 minutes alternating between high and low power, and that was for 40 minutes. In addition to that, they had separate treadmill sessions where they would build up to continuous walking of 20 minutes. They had upper extremity training 3 times a week, 12 to 15 repetitions of various different muscles. And then there was a concept of leisure walking, which when I worked with Roger, we renamed self-paced walking, which is a really helpful concept to actually get people able to walk far enough and long enough to actually do the things they want to in day-to-day life. And they did that once a week. Education was included with lectures, relaxation classes, recreational activities, and through those was provided psychosocial support. And really importantly, there was a home training routine that was brought in prior to discharge so that people knew what they could actually then continue with at home, where perhaps they wouldn't have the same level of equipment. Then after that first 2 months, they had 4 months of outpatient care. So they came back for weekly visits for that first month, then alternate weeks for the second month, and then monthly visits until the end of that 6 months. The control group just received conventional care from their general practitioner and respiratory specialist. So the outcome measures, measures of exercise and quality of life, were assessed 3 times even prior to randomisation, and that third time was the baseline measure. And then they had additional measures performed at 12, 18 and 24 weeks post-randomisation. And as you'll see in the analysis, it was the baseline and the 24 weeks post-randomisation that the main analysis was based on. So patients had full lung function and inspiratory muscle function. They did 2 6-minute walk tests at baseline on a 30-metre course. And a subgroup did multiple exercise tests. So they did 2 incremental cardiopulmonary exercise tests on a cycle ergometer a few days apart at the beginning. And they also did a constant work rate endurance test, and indeed the constant work rate duration was based on 60% power. As we heard, I couldn't find a questionnaire of the original CRQ, so this is one of our local Leicester adaptations, which is the self-report chronic respiratory questionnaire, but the one that was used for this study was interviewer administered, and it was with the patient's choice of activities rather than the standardised activities for the dyspnea domain. So for the statistical analysis, and this was beautifully brief, I think Lancet now, everything is so very much more complicated, but the stats for this was for each outcome. They did an unpaired t-test of the difference between baseline and the last available follow-up in the rehabilitation versus control groups. And they had then a 95% confidence interval around the mean differences between the 2 groups at final follow-up, and they were adjusted for baseline differences. Now, at that point, a power calculation isn't mentioned, but it is mentioned in the discussion that the sample size was chosen to detect a 30-metre between group difference, and at the time that was what had been published as an MID actually for bronchodilators. And then they also gave the information that the coefficient of variation of the 6-minute walk test was between 4 to 10%, so that's how it was calculated. So the results, so this is a typically diagram for a consort diagram that we now use. 118 out of the 244 people screened were ineligible. The majority of those was due to coexisting disease. 35 of those had ischemic heart disease. 8 were current smokers. 6 didn't achieve the spirometric criteria. 19 lived too far away, and the geography of Canada and even Ontario is huge, or certainly compared to those of us living in the UK. And 37 had other respiratory conditions. And at the time, actually trying to narrow down on the population for a study was very helpful. So out of the 126 that were eligible, 71% actually took part, 19 declined rehabilitation, 13 wanted to do an outpatient programme, and 5 didn't want to get randomised into the control group, so they actually declined randomisation. So for the demographics, a slightly older population with a mean age of 66. Reasonable gender balance. Overall, they had a normal BMI of just under 25. Quite a large smoking pack year history of over 50 in both groups, and you can see that overall they were pretty well matched. They were not acidemic, thankfully, because they had to be stable. And the FEV1 is worth noting because these patients really had very severe COPD. And if you recall, the entry criteria was an FEV1 of less than 40%. So the mean FEV1% predicted here was under 35 for both groups. They had airflow obstruction. There was also a significant number with supplemental oxygen, 14 in the treatment arm and 16 in the control arm. Now they gave the average 6-minute walk test distance, but I couldn't quite see it split per treatment group. So the outcomes at 24 weeks, and so just this is the difference between the differences between the two groups that we're looking at with the 95% confidence interval. They've been very upfront about how many actually completed these outcome measures. So 36 in the treatment arm and 41 patients completed the 6-minute walk test with a mean difference of 38 meters. Only 28 participants completed the constant power test, but where they did, there was a difference between the two groups in favour of rehabilitation of nearly 5 minutes. For the what I now call the CRQ, but here the chronic respiratory disease questionnaire, for the dyspnea, fatigue, emotional function and mastery domain, you can see that there was a significant difference in all domains. It was just borderline for the CRQ fatigue domain, and it achieved the intervention achieved the MID for both the dyspnea domain and the mastery domain. And that distance of 38 meters for the 6-minute walk test achieved the minimally important difference at the time, and the one that we have now. We've come full circle. So overall, a positive trial. So there was a bit more detail on those that either withdrew or didn't complete. There were 11 patients that withdrew overall, 7 in the intervention and 4 in the control. 3 had a prolonged exacerbation. I was actually quite surprised that there weren't more than that because of the severity of the disease. 1 had new onset heart disease, some arthritis that had limited the ability to exercise. 2 must have taken up smoking again. 1 had couldn't manage the travelling. 1 apparently, and this was the phrase in the text, that they had anger at not receiving oxygen. And I think we can all relate that sometimes that becomes a very difficult conversation. And 2 were very anxious at having to complete the questionnaires. So the discussion in the paper was that an 8-week inpatient pulmonary rehabilitation programme was associated with clinically relevant improvements in both walking distance and the dyspnea and mastery domains on the CRQ compared with usual care at 6 months. In a convenient sample, there were improvements seen in the cycle time, and just to highlight, cycling was not the training modality of the exercise programme, so that meant that there were translations between the walking exercise programme and improving fitness that we could see even on a different modality. There was no change in pulmonary function, and that was similar to had been seen with other studies, and that very much was leading then to what are the mechanisms behind the benefits. There was also, they tried to minimise the effects of improved compliance with medication through that 2-week run-in period. And as you will reflect, back in 1994, there certainly weren't the vast array of medications that we have now. The short-term improvements were similar to other smaller studies, but this was really the first study that had shown that those improvements were actually maintained at 6 months, and potentially due to the continued contact time over the last 4 months, and also the nested home training programme. They recommended further evaluation on the contributions of the various components of rehabilitation, the mechanisms of improvement, the appropriate setting, and the length and frequency of follow-up. And I've left 4 of those in italics because I think we're still debating some of those even today. They deliberately selected this very comprehensive supervised programme due to previous equivocal results. So they really wanted to say, if you know, really using the sort of best that we have, can we make a difference in this severe population? And they left it that clinical and cost effectiveness of an outpatient programme, which may be cheaper, needed investigating. So within 10 years, and my personal reflections when I was writing my intro to my thesis was really this was a golden decade for rehabilitation. I don't use the phrase landmark trial because it gets overused, but this one really was, and you could see that it was ramping up to leading to rehabilitation being integral to the management of people with COPD. The mechanisms that this trial again confirmed that these were not happening through improvements in lung function, and therefore highly unlikely to be based on medication alone or on the pulmonary mechanics alone. And I've put two papers here. Again, these are probably my personal skew, but I think Reese's paper then a year later, really looking at challenging that this wasn't just about contact time, that there really was true physiological training. And I wonder if actually we want to do that as a journal club at some point, because sometimes it is a trial that gets overlooked and is really critical. And then Francois Maltese went on and did a whole gamut of work, really looking at the skeletal muscle adaptation to endurance training. And this was a paper published 2 years later, which really provided a solid foundation of that physiological training that could occur even in people with severe COPD. The late Dr. Tim Griffiths then subsequently published his also landmark trial in 2001, in which then the clinical and cost effectiveness of an outpatient rehabilitation programme was established. And then in less than a decade, we then had this really solid systematic review and meta-analysis published in Cochrane. So Roger, you very helpfully gave us your personal reflections of how the study started. I've hopefully gone through what I can see of where the science went forward and where clinical care went forward in the next 10 years. But I wondered if you had further reflections really for how whether that changed things for you and what happened in clinical care going forward, and what you think your biggest reflections are really of where that paper led to.
Rachel, it's very generous of you to ask me. I don't want to get in the way of the discussants, but I would say a couple of things. First of all, as you'd mentioned in your introduction, this had all been done before by Tom Petty and by Alvin Barrack, both of whom had published treatises on management of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, both of whom had mentioned all the key points. I think the difference was with time, we now had valid, reproducible, interpretable outcome measures, thanks by and large to Gord Guyot at that time, but of course there are lots of other outcome measures that are used today. I think that allowed us to move forward. The population that I find myself seeing today is a little bit different. I think the mean age in this study were in the 60s. I'm seeing people in the 70s. I see people with multimorbidity. It's rare that I find simple, severe COPD. I don't know where they've gone. Maybe the background has changed and we're treating them better. I think we're seeing a much more complicated sort of patient. We have, of course, outpatient rehab, which is the most important way, the most important modality. Inpatient rehab is a luxury. And of course, we have virtual rehab. So we have other programs, we have other modalities of treatment. And maybe I would just say that it doesn't matter what your disease. Sorry about the code. I'll mute for 1 second. I'm sorry. 531.
Code white 4D Delta 531 has been cancelled.
I would say lastly that it doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. If you have a condition that limits your functional activities because of dyspnea and lung mechanics, you'll almost certainly become more sedentary. You'll have peripheral muscle weakness, whether it's part of an inflammatory process or just from disuse. you'll have depression and social isolation. So I think what we've seen is the spread of pulmonary rehabilitation to conditions far beyond COPD. Maybe I'll stop. I just don't want to hog the time, and I'm very interested to hear what the discussants have to say.
Lovely. Thanks very much, Roger. Alan, I will stop sharing and I will hand back to you.
Great. Thanks, Rachel, for a just truly wonderful presentation, giving a really great context and historical overview of the paper, both before and after. And thanks, Roger, for your reflections. Very interesting indeed. I'd now like to bring in the discussant panel. And just to reiterate, we have Dr. Marilyn Moy, Dr. Martijn Spruit, and Dr. Carolyn Rochester. Just before we bring them in and give their own reflections and possibly questions to Rachel and Roger, just to remind the audience, we also welcome questions and comments from the audience. You can raise your hand with the reactions function down at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to bring you online. Or you could also write your question in the chat, and we have Omid and myself and Lindsay keeping an eye on the chat to see what questions come up. So with that, I'll open it up to the discussant panel to share their thoughts.
Well, maybe I'll start. Roger, first of all, congratulations on this incredible work that you did, Rachel, for your great presentation. It's really really wonderful to revisit this paper in a detailed way. Roger, I think that I would echo what was said already, that this is really a landmark study, which together with Dr. Reese's and others really set the stage for pretty much most, if not all, of the future work that has been done in pulmonary rehabilitation, because demonstration of benefits, even in the severe population, was really unequivocal, and they were impressive benefits, in my opinion. I think this trial really led us to a whole new generation of interest in pulmonary rehabilitation. Importantly, as Rachel mentioned, understanding how pulmonary rehabilitation works from the physiologic and biologic perspective. And certainly Dr. Maltai's work and the work of others, but I also like to highlight Dr. Casabury's landmark work in this area as well, demonstrating that people, even with severe COPD, could achieve gains in aerobic fitness by undertaking exercise training. Just understanding, the whole understanding of skeletal muscle dysfunction, I think, was launched from demonstration of these early benefits of pulmonary rehab in these earlier trials. I think we've also gained a wealth of knowledge around all the different forms of exercise training that can be beneficial, different types of exercise, as well as the physiologic benefits of those types of exercise. And as Roger mentioned, we've been able to foray into demonstrating benefits for multiple disease groups: interstitial lung disease, pulmonary hypertension, lung cancer, asthma, cystic fibrosis, etc. And a lot has been done in that area. And I think we've also broadened out the outcomes of interest over the years, ever since this trial. I think this really set the stage for all of those things. I also think that the setting that you had in which to undertake this early research was incredible, in that you have this captive audience of people, if you will, people who were fairly stable COPD without a lot of comorbidities, who were able to be in an inpatient setting for rehabilitation. That type of thing doesn't exist in the United States. And so in order to be in an inpatient facility, one has to need a hospital level of care, or have a nursing level of care, such that inpatient care is absolutely required. And so it's really not been feasible to do these kinds of research studies in the US. So I think you had an exceptionally unusual environment in which to foster this type of research, and which you've gone on for many years and done a whole bunch of other additional wonderful research. I also think that this landmark study, just to finish up, has broadened our whole dialogue around access to pulmonary rehabilitation, policy in pulmonary rehabilitation, furthering discussions around resources and costs, and a bunch of things which are still active major issues today, and also to the consideration of more novel models. So congratulations, Roger, on this really landmark work, and we're delighted. I think everyone on this call is delighted to have been able to be part of the journey along with you in the subsequent years. You've certainly been a great mentor to me, and I all that you've done.
Great, thanks, Carly. Maybe Marilyn, would you like to offer some reflections from your side?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you're coming across.
Yeah, great. Okay, yeah. So thank you, Roger. Thank you, Rachael and Carly, for your insights. So reflecting, I think what is striking to me is that we are still trying to find solutions to these issues of access and long-term adherence. These are really shown in the paper, and I think I'm interpreting it. I would love to hear Roger's input, but that those first 2 months were really the core pulm rehab, and that the second 4 months would be the maintenance part, which we certainly these days are more focused on the core part and not the maintenance part. But this idea about the leisure walking is quite intriguing to me. And was really quite surprised and happily surprised to see it in this landmark paper, because as we know today, as home-based programs are launching and virtual programs are launching that are asynchronous, a lot of what's being offered is community-based walking, which I think is equivalent to the leisure walking that was in this paper. And I'm really fascinated to understand, what Roger's thinking was and what other people's thoughts are about what the role of community-based and leisurely walking plays in pulm rehab. Is it pulm rehab? We certainly know that in the GOLD guidelines that physical activity promotion and pulmonary rehabilitation are two very distinct recommendations. But what is the role of physical activity promotion in when we think about pulmonary rehab? Because as I said, currently, we are left with programs that are delivering just community-based walking, and is that pulm rehab? And then another thought is just trying to acknowledge the challenges of conducting a randomized controlled trial back 30 years ago and currently today. And this thought of, how much do we implement before we have evidence? I feel like we're in this space right now, especially with the virtual pulm rehab platforms. A lot of horses have come running out of the barn, and there's still not a whole lot of evidence yet. And yet, we are implementing. And I wonder if that was the feeling 30 years ago with just our regular conventional brick and mortar pulm rehab, if that was also the sense at that time. These trials are difficult. I think it was 36% of your screened patients who ultimately got randomized. So a lot of effort and work trying to enroll these participants. And where are we now? Do we need a randomized controlled trial to look at home-based and virtual pulm rehab programs, or is it okay to just extrapolate from what has been shown to be efficacious in the past? And then my final comment is about what we don't do anymore. So getting the ABGs, getting the CPETs for our exercise prescriptions, which were all very much parts of this paper. And raising the question of what else can we do less with. Raising the issue of, especially with the virtual pulm rehab programs, is it okay not to have a 6-minute walk test anymore? Are we still, going along the same spectrum? And, are there actually virtual based assessments and outcomes that we just haven't discovered, but are just as good if we, happen to run into, Gordon Guyatt again, right now in 2024, would he say, oh, it's fine to do a 1-minute sit to stand? I think, I'm raising more questions than providing answers, but I think it's interesting to see what has evolved since the 1994 with Roger's paper.
Yeah, thanks, Marilyn. And Roger, did you want to maybe reply to some of Marilyn's questions, or should we ask Martijn to give his thoughts first?
Ask Martijn to reply. He's well able to do so.
Okay, hopefully I see Martijn is in his car, so hopefully he is able to. Are you okay?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, yeah.
Sorry, I'm still in my car. I apologize for that, but Roger, I've been invited around the world to give a talk about the history of pulmonary rehab. And I always use the paper from Andy Rees to explain as one of the first papers with a randomized controlled trial showing the benefits of rehab. So I have to remake my slides if I give that presentation again, because I really like your randomized controlled trial. And congratulations on the 30th birthday. Some comment from my side. It's very interesting to see that the program that you have in West Park seems very similar to the program we have at Zero. Without knowing the setting, we also have leisure walks, we have exercise training, we do an interdisciplinary approach to very complex patients. So I was not aware of that you also offered inpatient, so that's very nice to know. What triggered me is that your inpatient program was 8 weeks, but the first reassessment was at 12 weeks. So I was wondering, why did you not match that with the 8-week program? I also like to know your thoughts when it's about the inclusion criteria, because you use very specifically lung function, in particular FEV1, as an inclusion criteria. I would not do that anymore at this time. And I know in the past that was very common, but I wonder if you would still do it, apply it again. And also, as Rachel already mentioned, you included only people who are not smoking anymore for the past at least 2 months or longer. I don't think we should do that, but I would like to hear your opinion on that. When it's about the intervention, I think it was rather state-of-the-art, but I do wonder if you would still do the diaphragmatic breathing, if you would do a randomized controlled trial now. I would question that, to be honest. And my final comment, now we try to classify or characterize patients at the baseline or use inclusion criteria, which are partly based on lung function, as I just mentioned. But should we focus more on other treatable traits, like psychological traits, anxiety, depression? What would you do about that if you would repeat the study at this moment? Would you also look at body composition or muscle dysfunction? And my really final comment would be, you were just saying that your current patient population changed a lot compared to 30 years ago. But perhaps we already were treating patients with severe COPD and comorbidities without being aware of that. So did the group of patients really change over time? Or are we now just more aware that there are more comorbidities which may influence the whole pulmonary rehab? So I'm wondering about your thoughts. Thank you.
Alan, would
Thanks,
you like
Martijn. And Roger, I see you were taking some notes there. Did you want to provide some replies to Marilyn and to Martijn?
I didn't realize it was an oral exam. I was just trying to keep up. Look, Martijn, so in terms of the easy answers, the design was intentional because I don't think we wanted to see that on the last day of the program, they could walk further. We kind of expected that. So we wanted to know if there was any carryover. So we deliberately cited the next data point to be a few weeks later. So that was an intentional design. In terms of pulmonary function criteria, no. I think our thinking has evolved. We always measure pulmonary function, as everyone on this call does, but I think we would look at other criteria, particularly the impact on functional activity, the impact on mood would be two areas that we often admit people who have very low exercise tolerance, but we think that we can improve them because we may just be improving their mood, their socialization, and non-FEV1 type factors. So I think our criteria have changed. With smoking, it's still a tough one. At that time, we had, I think, perhaps overly rigid criteria, but we still don't tend to take smokers right into the program. What we do is we refer them to a smoking cessation program. And so they have to be well into the smoking cessation before we enroll them. And our reason for that is it's simply a question of motivation. If you're not motivated to stop smoking, you're unlikely to be motivated towards the many other healthcare suggestions that we're making. So we're easier with smoking than we were, but we still regard it as an important negative for people who want to get the best out of pulmonary rehab. One last thing, if I may, though, because Marilyn had asked about the leisure walk. And one of the disappointing things about pulmonary rehab is that once we get these great numbers, they don't actually do more. It's been really a disappointment, which we've had to come to terms with. And Dick Zwalek talks about what you can do versus what you do. And the truth is, many of our patients don't actually do much more in terms of day-to-day activities than when they came. So we found things like the leisure walk to be very helpful, any sort of self-paced walk. And we found patients whose CRQ didn't change, nor did measures of mood, nor did 6-minute walk. But they may well have doubled or tripled their leisure walking time. So those would be my comments.
Thanks, Roger. And I wonder if we can just look now, Omid and Lindsay, just trying to look through the chat, or I don't see any hands up. Omid, do you see any hands up? But I think we have a couple of comments or questions in the chat. Did you want to bring a couple of those up, Omid?
Absolutely, Alan. Thank you all. I wanted to start with a few comments and questions, but before that, I was just gonna thank everybody for joining and also reflect on this moment. That is like, it very rarely happens that we are looking at a 30th birthday anniversary for a type of work that was done that was foundational. And in my perspective, it was very interesting that like a lot has changed, but still some of the things are relatively similar. My main focus was on the parts that the patients who were withdrawn because of the distance, because of all the somebody not getting along with the staff and some other like personal factors. And I was gonna bring these questions to the Rachael, Roger, and also the panel to see, considering that we still feeling there are a lot of similar issues with the same problem over like 30 years, that what are your guys' thoughts or how the, I don't know, the next 10 years is going to be with the pulmonary rehab, or how do you guys foresee this modality changing to accommodate these patients? That was my own questions, and then I'm gonna start with the comments.
Alan, do you want me to comment? I'm happy if Rachel.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Roger. Yeah.
I mean, going forward, I do think we're seeing a more frail patient and patients with multimorbidity, and I think our programs are going to have to be broader and not simply targeted on lung disease. By the way, I'm not at all certain, we all use the term pulmonary rehabilitation or respiratory rehabilitation. It's really rehabilitation of the patient with lung disease. And I think we're going to see we are already seeing a more complex and a more frail individual. Transplant, of course, has come on board. And so there's a huge opportunity for rehabilitation pre and post lung transplantation. I think those are important. And of course, virtual rehab to address issues of access and capacity, that's here to stay. I think going forward, we have a whole bunch of challenges. Combination of rehabilitation of the cardiac and pulmonary patient. Certainly the people with heart failure present very similarly. Chronic dyspnea with exacerbations, depression, sedentary lifestyle. They have a lot in common. Rachel's published on this, and so have others. So I think we may be taking the opportunity to double up some of our cardiac and our respiratory patients.
I think we need to continue to move ahead in the provision of a spectrum of models of pulmonary rehabilitation, which is going to take a lot further research in regards to not only cost effectiveness, but the logistics and practical aspects of implementation for a spectrum of models, and then not only to improve access, but to try to target, at least to some degree, the patient's individual rehabilitation needs in a so-called treatable traits approach to the type of model that they offer. Some people may need a lighter touch type of a program. For some people, it may be a predominantly a behavior change, physical activity, motivational and or educational approach. For others, it might be, really need gains in exercise capacity before any of the behavior change aspects can be realized. And so I think we have more sorting to do as to who's best for which model. I think we probably all agree that something's better than nothing. So access is certainly a key aspect of providing different models. But I think we have to move forward in understanding better, the patient's individual needs, and then prescribing a model of rehabilitation that will, in a targeted way, address those needs. But first, of course, we need the models to be implemented, and we're along with that.
Thanks. And Rachel, you have your hand up for comment.
Yeah, it's really in response to Lindsay's question about ethics and publication processes, which Roger's actually answered. But I suppose there is a broader reflection on the role of a clinical academic, and it is a concern. It's certainly a concern in the UK that whereas Roger, you were really giving a description of being a clinician with something that you could see was helping. Yes, there was science going along the way. But although you've said about the rec and things being similar, I mean, I find grant applications, ethics, governance, it can end up really becoming incredibly challenging. And I think as a community, we do need to really keep pushing back on this, actually, to what is really necessary. Otherwise, we just can't get these studies done, even if we've all got a vision of what we want to test. So it's really a comment rather than a question.
Thanks, Rachel. I see, Martijn, you have a comment.
Yeah, to respond to the question about what will the future bring. Last week, I gave 3 workshops to pulmonologists in the Netherlands. And I also showed them the paper of Peter Lindenauer in the JAMA of 2020, where he shows that people who start rehab directly after discharge from the hospital because of an exacerbation, that they have a better prognosis, a much better prognosis than those who are not referred for rehab or only later on. I showed those data, and none of the doctors knew this data. And it's almost 5 years old. And they also said if this was an oncology trial, everybody would start treating the patients with rehab because the survival effect was tremendous. So we do a great job in science. We do a poor job in marketing. And if we do a poor job in marketing, also the financial support will be limited. So if I had to answer the question, what do we need to do in the next years? Marketing, because we have so much evidence. And I understand we have to also look at different models or alternative models, and we have to decide which patient has to do which type of treatment available, and if resources are unlimited, and we do have to focus on the frail patients, but we do a very poor job in marketing. So my recommendation would be, thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much all for sharing your perspective. I have a few comments. I'm going to bring them up one by one by the order. I think the first one was mainly mentioned for Roger from PatCamp. It was if there was any comments in regards to use of pulmonary rehabilitation for tuberculosis in acute or subacute phase of infection. Any comments on that one?
Well, if I may say, the people who stumbled into pulmonary rehabilitation were the physiologists. It was the tuberculosis people who realized that rest is great for an inflamed lung, but as the lung heals, rest is a negative. And it was the tuberculosis people who first had the idea in the 19th century of promoting exercise. I'm not aware of programs specifically designed for post-TB. But I know ours will take people post-TB, and I'm sure others do as well.
I was just, to this point, Roger, I was just speaking at the Gold Conference last week with a physician from Nigeria who's got grant funding to implement pulmonary rehab more widely and is working with Sally Singh and others on the international grant front. She's part of the ATS MECOR group, and she said that their main patient population was the post-TB population. I think something we're going to see more of.
Thanks. And Omid, just looking at the time, got a couple of minutes, so maybe I don't think we'll get through all questions and comments, but maybe one or two more, and then just need to finish off with an announcement right at the end. So Omid, maybe one or two comments.
Sure. Absolutely. So I think that's probably going to be the last. It's a multi-segment question, but one of the audience, like Norma, mentioned if they're like, for example, like in New York State, like inpatient rehab not being available, if there are any comments on this individuals who have severe mobility issues like arthritis or balance issues, they are mentioning if there is any comments on the role of Tai Chi or role of nutrition in the rehab.
So would anyone on the panel like to reply to that?
I would say yes to all. I'm not crazy about Tai Chi. I know that literature fairly well. I haven't seen it as a great advance, but it depends on what you need to do is do your treatment method based on what outcome you're looking for. So there may be a role.
Yeah, Martijn here. I think there's some evidence that Tai Chi is beneficial for patients with COPD compared to usual care control. When it's about nutritional support, it depends a little bit on what type of patient you have at baseline. If it's a frail cachectic patient who needs energy-enriched and protein-enriched meals versus the obese patient who needs to lose body weight but maintain his muscle mass. So, but for sure, there's a role for a nutritionist or dietitian in the interdisciplinary rehab program.
Thanks, Martijn. Thanks, Roger. Unfortunately, we are coming to the end of the hour, so time has got the better of us. But I would like to take this opportunity to thank Drs. Goldstein, Evans, Moy, Spruit, Rochester, and Porshahid for their contributions. I'd also like to thank the audience for listening and interacting, and to Samantha Carpin at the ATS for all of her help. Apologies if we didn't manage to ask your question or answer your question, but please do head over to ATS Doc Matter to continue the discussion. And we will announce our next journal club in due course. And so just before we finish, I do have a special announcement, and I'm going to show a poster in a minute, but the World COPD Big Baton Pass 24-hour event hosted by Ruth Barker, Russell Winwood, and myself is starting today at 5 p.m. Eastern Time and continuing until 5 p.m. Eastern Time tomorrow. Now, you can visit the Big Baton Pass website for more information, where you will also find the link to watch the live event. We encourage you to consider setting up a watch live party with the event playing in clinical waiting rooms or PR gyms, and to also profile the event within your clinical teams and patients during the day in whatever work you work in. And I just want to actually quickly show, hopefully this will come up. Oh, I hit the wrong one there. Sorry. Let's try that again. We're running out of time. There we go. Wrong one is coming up. Sorry about that. Let me check.
That's right, Ellen.
It looks right to us.
Oh, okay. Is that looking good?
We wouldn't know any different, Alan. Yeah.
So it's please, folks, we're getting started in about 4 hours from now, and it goes on for 24 hours. The Big Baton Pass. So if you Google on Big Baton Pass, you will find the website, and you can watch live. And it's many events. I know many contributors on this call today. So thank you all for today. Wishing you all a great rest of the day, and we hope to see you soon. Bye for now.